The instructional design group is really thankful to Brad Kirkman for his willingness to share his expertise in creating teams and his research and method into that process. I know you're going to find intriguing. I am going to drop into the chat a document that we have created, Brad and I, that has some helpful links. One of them is the instrument that he's going to be talking about this afternoon. And then the other is a link to the slide deck should you want to take a look at it as we're moving through the presentation. So Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for the IDG for asking me to talk a little about this. I was just thinking this morning, we first started using Teams in business schools in the early 90s. And there's still a problem. 30 years later, we're still dealing with issues that crop up. In fact, I taught my first class ever in 1991 and started using Teams at that point. So I think we've learned a lot, but again, they're still a little bit problematic. What's funny, I was interviewed by Bloomberg Business Week back in 2014. They were kind of wanting to know why MBA students always groan and roll their eyes when they're assigned another team project. I didn't know they were going to call the article Why American B School Students Can't Stand Teamwork. It was a little stronger than I was thinking, but I did say one of the reasons that I think in the US we have this issue is because a lot of people that do the cross-cultural research have indicated that the United States is one of the most individualistic countries in the world. We certainly see that playing out in current events these days. And so people that are very individualistic don't really want to have their performance or their rewards or their grades depending on someone else's performance, right? They want to be judged on their own merits, individual merits. But the problem with that is that in organizations, you know, everything is done in teams today. It has to be because what we're trying to accomplish is so complex and dynamic and volatile that there really isn't any other way to tackle these big picture problems other than teams. So despite people kind of maybe not wanting to work in them sometimes or feeling like they don't want their grade to depend on somebody else, it's kind of, you know, it's too bad. This is what we're doing. So I think we're kind of stuck with teams, I often say. So, but that does play into why you'll see some people push back on teams. Although now in our MBA program, we were just ranked, I think, #1 in diversity, in terms of #1 ranking in diversity. So we're very proud of that. So we have people in our programs with a variety of different values. And so they're not all individualistic. Oh, the other thing I found recently is this survey of America's most hated office jargon, things that they can't stand hearing in organizations. And of course, the top two are exactly what I do for a living. I study synergy and teamwork, and people hate that. I know when I wrote a book on team leadership, one of my friends who works for a bank here in town said, "Oh gosh, I hope you're not going to talk about synergy in your book." I'm like, "Well, I have to talk about synergy. That's a fundamental property of teamwork." And he said, "Well, when one of our bosses walks into a room and says, we're going to create synergy with this deal or this situation, we just all kind of shut down again." So there's a lot of pushback. Yeah, it's not too bad. That's right, 4%. That's it. But there's still a lot of pushback on these synergy and teamwork. Some people feel kind of burned out about teams. So everything we're going to talk about today kind of has to be dealt with that backdrop in place. I should ask you in the chat also, do you think that when we assign students to work together to do projects, do you think they're mostly group projects or do you think they're team projects? And if you don't know the difference, just put whatever you think. Do you think people at Poole College are working mostly in groups when they're doing their assignments or mostly in teams? All right, I got a mixture, about half and half, groups and teams. So there's a difference. People tend to use these terms interchangeably. A team is a group is a team, which is actually fundamentally untrue. So the definition of a team is it's an interdependent collection of people who are mutually accountable and share responsibility for specific outcomes. And so that word is key, the interdependence, which is the extent of communication, coordination, integration, and collaboration required between people to accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish. A group, it's more about learning from each other, sharing ideas, but they're not interdependent and not necessarily working toward a shared goal. So I always say when I assign my MBA students a team paper, let's say there's 4 students and I want the paper to be 12 pages and I want them to turn it in 2 weeks. And you say, how do they do that? Like, how do they actually logistically write that paper? Well, it turns out that if they're honest, they'll admit that they split it up and person 1 writes 3 pages, person 2 writes 3 pages, person 3 writes 3, person 4 writes 3. And the night before it's due, they stitch it together in Microsoft Word and put a couple of transition sentences in there and they turn it in and they call that a team paper. That is absolutely not a team paper. That involved no teamwork whatsoever, or very minimal amount of teamwork. So it's actually a group paper. So what we find is that most people in Poole College and other universities, when you give them an assignment to do together, they actually end up doing it as a group. They split it up, divide and conquer, and then put it together at the end. So one thing I often tell my students is, I really want this to be a team assignment. When you can write this paper as a group, maybe you will, that's what you want to do. I can't control it. But I try to say like, well, I really want you to learn about teamwork. So why don't you try writing this paper as a team, not sitting down at a computer, 4 of you looking at a computer. What do you want the first word to be in this paper? No, and yeah, that's the worst way to write a paper as a team. But you can get together as a team, maybe create a joint outline together as a team. Maybe somebody writes the first couple of paragraphs, sends it to the rest of the team. They edit it. Somebody says, oh, I've got an article I think would fit here. And by the time you turn that paper in, it should have changed hands between those 4 people dozens of times. So one of the things is I always say, don't let people work as a group. We're really trying to teach teamwork. And so the first part of that is teaching people what it means to do a task as a team. So that's kind of lesson number 1. Now, once you get past that and you've got people really saying, all right, we're going to do this as a team. Let's not work as a group. Let's do a team assignment. The question is, how do you put these teams together? And my first rule has always been, although I should say I haven't done this since 2012 when I last taught undergrads. I've been teaching MBAs exclusively here at NC State. And in the full-time program, the MBA office puts the teams together. So I'm not in charge of that. And in the part-time professional, we do temporary teams. We don't really have long-term teams. So it's been a while for me, but I never let people choose their own teams. And my slogan for that is, you can't take your friends to work. So we're not going to let you pick your friends here. And then we know from research on diversity that people will choose people that look like them, that think like them, that act like them. So they'll tend to flock together in similar teams. And you don't want that, right? We have a big diversity initiative at NC State and Poole College, and we're really emphasizing the power of diversity. All the research shows that diverse teams perform better than homogeneous teams when it comes to innovation, creativity, quality. So I basically form the teams myself. And I also do that using a personality test called the Big 5 personality instrument. It's the most scientifically validated personality test we have in the world. It's not the Myers-Briggs. The Myers-Briggs has not a lot of science behind it. It's easy. It's a quick test to take. A bunch of companies use it. Universities use it, but there's not a lot of science behind the Myers-Briggs. Great documentary on, I think it's Netflix, that talks about that. But this is the Big 5. And the Big 5, as the name suggests, measures people on 5 personality traits: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. One of the things you'll notice right away is the Myers-Briggs is like, nothing's bad or good. We're just different. You're just a P, I'm a J. With the Big 5, it's not actually true. Some of these can be dysfunctional for certain outcomes. So like neuroticism is one that, obviously you don't want to be super high in neuroticism. It can interfere with your job performance and relationships, those sort of things. So these are the 5 personality dimensions. If I can get your scores on these 5 dimensions, I've pretty much captured 95% of your personality. So it's a very powerful tool. I can learn most of what I need to know about you from just these 5 dimensions. So once I get the scores for everyone's personality test, then I start the process of putting people into teams. One of the things I do, which probably seems a little controversial at first when you hear it, is I put the top 4 most conscientious people I have in the class in a team. And then I take the second most conscientious, the 4 that are the second, third, fourth, all the way down to, oh my gosh, you're so low in conscientiousness. I can't even believe you're in college, but that's okay. So people say, well, how can you do that? Wouldn't that affect the grade? Because those that are dependable and reliable would get the best grades, and those that are the opposite would not. And I did research on this and found that there's no correlation between the way I put these teams together in terms of conscientiousness and the grading. The reason it comes in handy is because the most conscientious people want to complete their project 2 months before it's due. That's how they work. They don't want to wait to the last minute. They want to get it done early, and then relax. And the people that aren't very conscientious, that are the low, they want to wait until the night before it's due. They won't do anything until the final day. And actually, it turns out they're pretty good at it. That's how they work. That they need that stress, they need that pressure to be able to deliver. So it turns out that the teams that are super low in conscientiousness can get as good grades or better than those that are high. What this prevents is conflict and argument in the team, and it also prevents social loafing. Because what happens when you put 2 people who are super conscientious and 2 that aren't very conscientious, these 2 are going to do all the work. They're going to do it early. They're going to get it done. These people will skate and be slackers. And so that sort of defeats the purpose of having teamwork. So it's really more of a style of how they want to work together to get their task or projects done. I also balance extroversion and introversion. So I'll put 2 extroverts and 2 introverts in a team. And by the way, this is all scientifically validated. We've done studies of how personality traits mixed together in a team result in outcomes. So this is not just my thinking. This is based on some solid scientific evidence. So the evidence would show that if you put all extroverts in a team, they just talk all the time, they don't get anything done. If you put all introverts in the team, they never say anything, they don't communicate, so they can't get anything done. So having that balance of extroversion and introversion is critical. And then I also tell my students openly in the beginning, hey, I'm using a scientifically valid way to build your teams, which is true. But I also think it has kind of a priming effect. Like they kind of get excited about that. Like, oh, he's building the teams to maximize how good we're going to be. So there are 2 things going on here. 1, I'm using science, which is good. And 2, it kind of becomes an expectation of the teams that I'm building them in a way that they're going to do well. So I think they already start out with a leg up on their performance. And then the last 2 things I would say is, again, I would always try to maximize gender diversity, race, ethnicity, nationality, because again, all the research would show that the more diverse the team is in terms of those characteristics, the more success you're going to have. So you're going to have to blend together these things, right? Take the conscientious, the extroversion, introversion, and then the demographic diversity to try to build teams. And that's what I've been doing pretty much probably for about 15 years when I was building my teams myself. Then also try to keep the teams pretty small, because the larger your teams get, the more slacking you're going to get. And it's just more difficult to get people to meet at certain times, the larger teams. So I've always tried to keep my teams at 4, if at all possible. It's kind of a sweet spot. It's big enough that you're getting the diversity and the different backgrounds and perspectives. But also it's not too large that you're getting social loafing and slacking and coordination difficulties. The other thing we find in university settings, since there aren't really formal leaders in these teams to kind of enforce behavior, you do get a lot of social loafing or slacking. So there are things that we've learned in organizational settings, some of which are, you can translate them into a university setting. Some are a little bit more difficult, like public posting, making individual team members' contributions identifiable. I do that with peer evaluations, which I'll talk about in a second. I would try to make sure the teams are working on something they find interesting, challenging, involving. People tend to slack off less when they're doing things they're really engaged in. So I let my teams pick the topic they want to do if it's a paper from a big list of topics to try to give them their number 1 or number 2 choice in the class. And that means they're really engaged in something they want to study, they want to learn more about. Rewards, again, that would be more about the grades. Building trust can be difficult. There are some trust building exercises that you can use with your teams. Making them responsible and accountable, that's also peer evaluations. Team contract, we make our full-time MBA students create a team contract or charter at the very beginning. I run that day with them, and they have to decide how they want to work together as a team, how they want to communicate, how they want to interact. And then I make them sign their team charters and contracts at the end, because the full-time MBAs are together in the same team for an entire year, which makes that contract kind of important for them. Team review and feedback would be kind of you stepping in and reviewing what they're doing, giving them feedback. And then again, of course, keeping the teams as small as possible will help that social loafing. So there are ways that you can avoid this kind of slacking behavior in your teams. And the conscientiousness, sort of using conscientiousness as a way to do that also helps as well. This is typically what I would put on my peer evaluations. I like them to list their names. I like them to put percentages of what they did versus what the other students have done. I have them qualitatively describe what they did on the project. What did you do? Did you do lit review? Did you write? What did you do? Any problems or difficulties you had, and then any other comments. And when I use the peer evaluations to adjust the grades of my team projects. So I rarely gave every member of the team the same grade, because I based the grading on what they're saying about what they did. There's something really important about that. I wouldn't let the students, I told them not to share their grades with their fellow team members, because I didn't just deduct, say, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. There might be people in the team that got an A and some in the team that got a C or even a D. So the grades can be radically different depending on what these peer evaluations are indicating. So I wouldn't allow them to share their grades, because if you do allow them to share their grades, people are more hesitant to say what's really going on in the team. And in the beginning, I sort of had trouble figuring out how to use this, but after a while, you see patterns in these peer evaluations, and you can pretty much tell when 1 or 2 people in the team didn't do a whole lot. It comes together pretty clearly in that respect. So again, I use peer evaluations. I don't let them share their grades, and I adjust grades pretty dramatically based on what I saw in the evaluations, not just 2 or 3 points. I make it meaningful for them. And I tell them that at the very beginning. I'm not shy about that. I say, some of you, if you don't do anything in your team, you're not going to get a good grade. I feel the same way. I'm not a sucker. I'm not going to do everybody's work and we're all going to get the same grade. It's not how it works in life. So I make that very clear up front, that their grades are going to vary tremendously based on the evaluation. So they take that pretty seriously, and it helps to also reduce that slacking behavior. I don't know if you've seen this model of team development. It's used everywhere in the world. I put the date on it. It's a very old, outdated team development model. Forming is like when the team comes together. Storming is there's conflict about how we're going to work, how we're going to get things done. Norming is the team starts to agree on how it wants to do something. Performing is it gets it done. And then lastly, if you want it to rhyme, I guess, adjourning is when the team kind of finishes and breaks apart. And the reason that I bring this up is because a lot of people expect, because this model has been around for a long time, that this is how student project teams are going to kind of unfold in terms of development. And I would say that's not true. In fact, I use this model as a warning to people. I say, this is not how most teams work. In fact, this guy, Tuckman, was an educational psychologist studying therapy groups, people that come together and talk about their problems once a week. So it's not really applicable. And I don't find it very applicable in organizations either. I always say, when you have your airline cockpit crews, which are teams of 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the size of the plane, how far it's flying. Do you want your airline cockpit crews going through these stages of development? You do not. No, you don't want them storming. And I think we should fly at 10,000 feet. I think we should fly at 30,000 feet. I think we should turn left. I think we should turn right. No, all you want from your airline cockpit crews is to form and perform. That's it. And so again, this model kind of ignores all that we know about organizations. The model that I use that I think is more applicable to student teams is called the punctuated equilibrium model. And a lot of you are academics, you have to call things you have to use really complicated names to make it sound like you're really adding a lot of value. But Gersick called this the punctuated equilibrium. She borrowed that from biology, which is it's a theory that animals go through periods of kind of relative stability and then rapid change, and then relative stability and rapid change. So she said, I could borrow this theory from biology and bring it into the teams world and see if I can learn something about how teams develop over time. And she did that. She took a bunch of MBA students, put them in teams of, I think it was 5, and gave them 2 hours to design. I think it was something creative they were supposed to produce. And she said she didn't see this Tuckman model at all. Tuckman was not even relevant to what she was studying. She found a phase 1, a midpoint transition, and then a phase 2. If you can guess, since there aren't that many of us, we can do this verbally. We don't have to do it in chat. What do you think happens if I gave my MBAs 2 months to write a paper? What do you think happens in the first month? What do you think happens in the first half of their project life cycle?
Not much.
Yeah, when I get my MBAs to admit, honestly, what happens in phase 1, some of them will say, well, we're goal setting and we set objectives and we assign roles. I'm like, no, you don't. You don't do anything. And then inevitably, what Gersick found in her study too was that at the there's something magical about midpoints in people's lives, like midlife crisis, whatever it is. It's like the midpoint is when somebody steps up and says, oh my gosh, guys, we just blew a whole month of doing nothing. We have got to get this project on track. So that's where that squiggly line comes in and suggests that that's where there's reassignment of roles. And now we're going to talk about strategy. And then all the work is carried out in phase 2. That's what most, I think, project teams in our setting would look like. And when I first started assigning group work, teamwork in the early 90s, I would just assign it at the beginning of the semester and say, all right, you got 3 months. And at the end of the semester, I need a paper and you need to do a presentation. And I did nothing else. And it was a complete disaster. People hadn't even met their teammates like a week before it was due. I got parents calling me, people crying. And I was like, why am I not using my own material? This model came out in 1989 and I'm like, not even thinking about it, not even using it. What's that saying? A cobbler's children has no shoes. Yeah, I don't know what that means. Anyway, that's random. But anyway, I guess I'm too close to this material to be able to use it. So I said, well, let me start using this. So with every team, I had a kickoff meeting. Then I had a couple of checkups here and here. The cobbler's children, yeah. Yeah, you're too close to your own stuff. I had a midpoint checkup here, and then I had a rough draft due here. We did peer evaluations and then a project deadline. And you know what happened? Magically, mysteriously, the teamwork was much better because I didn't let that period of inertia kick in. I was able to make use of that phase 1 because teams left to their own devices, they develop very bad habits. They develop them very quickly and they're sticky. They're tough to change. So I would recommend that those of you using Teams should be involved and set some intermediate guidelines and milestones and definitely do a midpoint checkup. That's where people are really open to change and doing things differently. That will help your teams a lot. Questions? Anything on your mind?
So I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
I know that at least one of our faculty, the way that they do peer evaluations is to ask all the team members to basically give out bonuses to each other. That's how they have to assign the points. And they do not allow the team members to give equal points, right? So they can't say everybody gets 25%. They have to rank them. And I'm just curious what you think about that method.
I don't do that, but I think it does prevent the standard response, which a lot of students will probably have, particularly undergrads, I think. I'll just give everybody, if it's a team of 5, I'll just give everybody 20%, just to avoid, or they'll say, I don't want to rat anybody out. I'm not a rat. I'm not going to tattletale on somebody. And I talk about that too in the beginning of the class. I say, it's not about ratting out. It's not about tattletaling. It's about, look, you should be recognized for what you're doing. And if people aren't doing it, they should not be recognized. That's the way we should, that's what's fair. So I get the rationale behind that, because they're not allowing the knee-jerk 2020 reaction. And so, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. I haven't done it, but I'm not opposed to it.
Hey, Brad, this is Bonnie. I'm thinking about this through the lens of undergraduate students specifically, but I work with our student ambassadors who are, they're student leaders, and they're leaders in the classroom and outside the classroom. And I think that the conversation that's been coming up with them is this virtual world. We've all transitioned to virtual. There wasn't really a culture of undergraduate groups meeting virtually pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And then everybody went virtual. So that was the requirement. And I think I'd just be interested to hear if you even just kind of like best practices of like even the concepts of Zen versus virtual for undergraduate level in collaboration, or like having some, long story short, I had a conversation with a student the other day, and they said, we met for 2 hours, and it was like the same kind of 2 hours that, students would have said 2 years ago, but it's like, we didn't even know where to start, or the logistics of there's just some technical logistics now that they're trying to figure out. And, there's all these different platforms, and I think they went from Teams to Zoom to WebEx, because one of the students had interned somewhere that used WebEx. And, that's just, it's a learning curve that's part of the project, that if they haven't had to do that before, I don't know, just as we're coming into this back to a hybrid element, specifically with the undergraduates. I feel like for MBAs, they've got more of those experiences, but if you have any kind of startup guide of working with a group virtually, or just kind of, I know you don't teach a ton of undergraduate classes, but things that you've maybe shared in other settings that you think might be helpful.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because the undergraduates are not alone. A lot of companies are having the same issues around, we've never done this before, and what are the rules? And so I think we're kind of in the wild, wild west. I wish there was a definitive guide on this, although I think there's a lot of research being done right now to help, and it's out there and it's growing. I'm reviewing it, some of it myself. So I'm writing another book on teams and team resilience, and I have a whole chapter on how to make sure your virtual teams are resilient even when you can't be around people. So, I don't know the whole answer, but I wonder if it would be helpful to have a session in some format for our undergraduates specifically. And I work with the MBA, so they get this instruction from me, how to have a virtual meeting. But I wonder if it would be helpful to have the undergraduates exposed to a module on ground rules, guidelines, best practices that we've learned. And it doesn't have to all be research. We could call on the faculty to, help us understand what's been really working for them. One of the most interesting findings that came out, I've been recommending that people use a camera on policy, because it's better at recreating the face-to-face, right? And you can see the engagement, you can get the nonverbal. It's a richer way of meeting, because left to their own devices, people oftentimes turn their cameras off. So I've been saying that pretty much through the entire pandemic. And then a colleague of mine at University of Arizona, Allison Gabriel, just came out with a study in Journal of Applied Psychology, where she found that there are certain situations where you should turn your cameras off. And what she found was that when you're on camera all day, you actually end up feeling more fatigued by the meeting. And that fatigue leads to lower participation in the meeting and lower engagement in the meeting. And I was like, oh, mind blown. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean,
go ahead, Bonnie.
No, I was thinking as you're saying that, it's it's almost like a tax of being on, right? Your eyes are engaged, but something that came up with the undergraduate students is this concept of trust. And I say this as I'm currently, full disclosure, I decided to go walk during this meeting because I had been on the screen a good bit this morning, and I don't want my step team to be let down. So Allison or Alyssa, who's on my step team, I promise I'm getting us some steps during this. But I think that, for the undergraduate students, there was a sense of frustration of those that didn't have their camera on, that they weren't trusting that they were engaged. Not talking plus no camera was like not engaged. So no, I definitely, and may circle back around with you, of this idea of a module or something specifically for our concentrations, like the IT, accounting, marketing, that have these group projects, because it's a different level, especially when there's an option to meet in person. And I think that's something I've been thinking about is more from an access standpoint, for our students that are some of our more privileged students. It's coming to campus, paying for parking, coming at night. They don't have other jobs. That's still something they would prefer to do, to meet in the library. But for others that are non-traditional students, this all of a sudden opens up an opportunity for them to connect virtually. But yeah. Okay. More to come. It just has my brain kind of thinking, because that's definitely something in the undergraduate space. I mean, it's a researcher's dream. There's so much content coming out that you can research, but any kind of best practices, it's just not something that they're used to meeting up, and then they didn't have an option a year ago. And now that they have an option, it's just helping them manage their time in that space. So that's helpful.
Yeah. I think that I would recommend that they do have cameras on for that reason. And the other reason is that I think these studies where people are on Zoom like 8-9 hours a day in organizational settings, meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. And some of us have that same issue, but I think with the undergrads, it wouldn't necessarily be all day, every day on camera, which is where that fatigue sets in. The other thing they found in that study is that the fatigue was felt more strongly by women and more strongly by people who were new to the organization, that they suffered even more from camera on. I didn't read enough to know. I'll go back to the article to figure out why they think that is. The other thing that we've learned about these type of meetings is you should minimize your own picture. So go with speaker view so that you're tiny and everybody else, you can see them more and you can see the speaker. The reason also is that it's kind of like when I'm teaching, if I had my face blown up while I'm teaching, it's the analogy is like somebody coming into my physical classroom, putting a giant mirror in front of me and following me like this as I'm teaching the class, right? I don't want that. And I don't like myself on camera anyway. So I think most people don't. And so there's also stress that comes with looking at yourself while you're doing one of these meetings. You're critiquing yourself. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. And it just creates more stress. So that we know for sure that you should not, I guess, unless you're extremely narcissistic, you should not have the pictures equal size so that you see yourself equally. You want to minimize yours and have speaker view to reduce your stress. But I think with undergraduates, I'd probably lean more towards camera on for the trust issue you talked about, and the fact that they're probably not on Zoom 8-9 hours a day. At least I hope they're not on Zoom that long. But yeah, maybe we could come up with some best practices, and it wouldn't have to be anything major. It doesn't have to be 2 hours on best practices. It could even be a document as opposed to a presentation, something that kind of captures these practices for them. Because again, you're right, Bonnie, this is new to them. For most of our MBAs that are full-time working and all that, they have companies helping them. They have organizations that provide best practices and whole departments devoted to this stuff, whereas the undergraduates don't. Other questions? Anything else? All right. Thank you. Heidi, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. This is really interesting. And I wanted to I actually had a question, if that's okay, really quick before we move forward. I wanted to ask, how do you incorporate the performance evaluation or the peer feedback evaluation if a student doesn't do it, or like, is there a grade attached to actually doing that piece of the assignment?
There is. Yeah, there is. I can't remember exactly how I did it, but I penalized for people not turning it in, because if they don't turn it in, then you've got an incomplete picture of what happened, right? I need all peer evaluations submitted, and I'll have to go back and look what I said in the syllabus to promote that. But there was a penalty for not doing it, for sure.
Okay, great.
Otherwise, some people wouldn't do it. I mean, that's just fact.
Yeah. Any other last minute questions for Brad? Well, this is really helpful, and I want to thank you so much. And I'm really interested in taking the personality quiz myself. And I'm going to drop the link in again to the document. I see some people have just joined us again, but you can find the link to the personality quiz, and then you can see the slide deck as well, and some other helpful links that Brad and I have put together for you. Part of this session was to see also, are there any questions from the participants about how you might use Moodle to engage in effective teamwork. And so I didn't know if anybody had questions about that or wanted to share their own experience of how they've maybe used Teams in Moodle. Everyone's so quiet. Has anybody used Teams, like set up Teams in Moodle so that students use that as they move throughout their semester? No, Alyssa's saying no.
I've set up groups, but not, is that what you mean? Just different grading groups or different groups?
Yeah, different groups.
Yeah, I've set them up. I'll just say that if you have a discussion forum and you have the groups be separate where they have to answer a question, when you copy that course over, you have to add those questions again for each group, where everybody responds to the same one, and that's not. So there's just some technicalities with Moodle and setting up groups that you want to be aware of.
Yeah, I guess. And yeah, and Eileen, if you don't mind commenting too, like, what was your reasoning for creating those groups within your course?
It's an online course, and it's just too many to have 50 people all comment on one discussion question. So keeping them in their teams for each discussion forum lets them talk to just each other. And then the grading is amazing there, because you can grade each person and you don't have to scroll through all the discussion posts. It will just show the person's posts, so you can see all their posts separately, and then you can use a rubric and grade them. So the grading is really easy when you do discussion forums set up as groups. But I will say you have to copy that question and post it to every group every time you do a course. It's not that much work, but if you don't, then you're going to find yourself in trouble.
Yeah, they have nothing.
Yeah,
there's nothing to respond to.
Making sure that students know if you require an assignment for a team, that the last person to submit, that's the assignment you're going to grade. So they need to decide who's going to submit. Otherwise, they'll submit over a complete version with an incomplete version, and then you're grading an incomplete version. So they need to know whose responsibility it is to submit the final version, because it writes over the old version. And I can only see the last one that was submitted by a member of that group.
Yeah, good. Brad, how do you handle that in your courses? The group or the teams submitting their work?
So Lee Shamblin is sort of the leadership. She's our director of leadership, and she is kind of helps with the logistical piece of that. So we haven't been really doing that. The three of us that teach that course, Roger Mayer and Beth Ritter and I, really rely heavily on Lee for that. I mean, when they I don't have them actually, weirdly, said the teams guy, have them do a lot of team graded projects, at least for my modules. I'll have them work in teams, and then they'll write an individual paper about their experience working in the team, what they learned, what they want to do better. So they submit that in Moodle. I can go into Moodle, download all those papers, and I just grade them one by one. So I haven't really used the Teams function in Moodle. And if we do, oftentimes it might be Lee who's doing it.
Okay, thank you. It is really, Beth saying the individual reflection is a great teaching tool.
The only drawback of that is they want a rubric for, what's this rubric stuff? When I first started teaching, we didn't have rubrics, but anyway, give me a rubric for exactly what you're looking for my individual reflection. And I'm like, it's an individual reflection. There is no rubric. Everyone is different. Every paper is different. I can't give you a formula for reflection. It's a personal journey. So that's the only pushback I get on those, is like, you didn't tell us what you wanted. I'm like, I wanted you to reflect. So do that how you do it best.
I'm probably guilty of why your students are asking for that, Brad, because I have guided questions and a rubric, and I'll ask them specifically. And I do this because it's non-cheatable. I will say, in your group, tell me about a time when you disagreed with someone.
Yeah.
And what was the outcome of that disagreement? Or were you able to convince them, or did you change your mind? And so they can't cheat that, right? And if they didn't participate, they have nothing to say. They can make something up, but I actually have specific reflection questions.
Yeah,
and then a rubric about it.
I do too. Maybe I sold myself short, but I do have a 3-part to my reflection, right? So I say, tell me about this, tell me about that, tell me about that, as a guide, but I don't do anything more than that, I think.
Yeah, I might ask them, what surprised you most, or how did you prepare for the presentation?
Yep.
What was unexpected? When you started this project, you had expectations. What changed by the end?
Yeah.
And they really, again, they can't cheat those, and they can't give you a shallow. And I say, don't give me shallow responses.
Yep.
They
do that.
And that's part of the rubric, deep reflective thinking.
Yeah, they do that sometimes. They stay at the surface level. Or I'll say, use this chapter or use a chapter from a book to apply it to a work situation you've had. And then you can tell they don't even read it. It's like, you didn't read that chapter. It's too surface level, you know.
Hey, Brad, this is Scott. I do have my undergrads do a reflection. Bonnie, I did see your comment. Yeah, they think it's very strange to do a reflection, but I do give them a series of questions they have to answer. How I grade them, I agree with you, Brad. There's no rubric on how I grade them, but I do say in your reflection, you need to cover these areas. So that's as much direction as I give.
I think it's good for undergraduates to start to learn the power of reflection as a learning tool. I think that's great.
Totally agree. And I would say Scott and Eileen, consistently, I would say the accounting undergraduate students are the most likely to have a reflection in a Poole class across all the different majors and concentration. So I think with the different critical thinking work that y'all are doing and different practitioners, but they are uncomfortable with it. We don't run from uncomfortable, but they're not used to that experience. So any and all opportunities that they can get that is good, because they'll be asked to do that in other things.
It's good to give them the questions at the beginning of the project too, because that way they can be answering the reflection as they're working through the project, not at the very end where they've got to think back to a time.
Totally agree. I do the same thing. Give it to them up front. Just say, look, I'm going to give you the final exam question before we start, right? So you can begin to take notes and think about, oh, this is what I want to say about this. I think that's, don't wait till the end. No.
It's not a surprise, right?
No, it's not a trick. No, it's not a trick. No.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say too, like, if you want to add, Eileen or Scott, if you want to add to that document that I shared, any of the reflection questions that you typically use, that might be really helpful for faculty who might come into this meeting or recording and come into the document to see some ideas for what they might do to ask, particularly undergrads, to think about reflection and to complete some of those projects. So feel free to add to that document if you want to, when you have time.
I'll probably add a link to my reflection questions. It's a Google doc, and someone can just take them and
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Heidi, I'll do this. I'll give it to Jessica and Jessica can post it to your document. How's that?
That sounds good. Yeah, that would be
I have a thing with Google Docs. So anyway, so Jessica, if you want to post it, I'll have to go through Jessica.
great. What is your thing with Google Docs?
I hate them.
They changed all the sharing on them, so now old things are not findable. I don't know why they did that, but
The big thing about Google Docs is they don't work like Word. End of sentence. If Google Docs were like words, it would make sense.
you can save them as a Word doc and they'll open and then close as a Word
But you
doc.
can't adjust them, you can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And how many times did you think you saved it in Google Doc and it wasn't there when you went back? It didn't save it.
It should always be there.
I know, but it doesn't. No, like comments don't always take. If you're
Oh, you have to check, you have to put the
comments
check
don't
mark
Yeah.
and put reply. That
It
is
is so
tough.
much easier in Word, folks. It is so much easier in Word.
Personal preference. Sounds like some personal preference things happening. So yes, Jessica, if you want to add that Google Doc for Scott or that
My
link.
team knows, do not send me a Google Doc.
Maybe we need to have a Google Doc workshop. Yeah. Any
Oh,
other?
IT already offers those.
Yeah, they do,
We're
right?
good.
I was thinking that they do.
But I was just thinking, Scott, we do everything. Heidi and I do everything in Google. Like, if I don't have anything saved on my computer, it's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas about working in groups and teams? What maybe technology you use and don't use, or things that you feel like you might want to share out with faculty members or instructors that are utilizing group or team projects?
I came on late, so maybe it was covered, but just the type of project, if it can be divided up, students will divide it up. But if the point is for them to work together, tell them you can't divide this up, you have to work together.
Yeah, we talked
You
about
covered that, I'm sure.
probably 90% of the time they're doing group work, not teamwork. Group work is dividing it up and the night before it's due, putting it together in Microsoft Word and turning it in. That's fine. It's just there's no teamwork involved in that. So I talk to them about the difference between a group and a team and how they might go about doing this project as a team and why that might be beneficial.
Yeah, great. Well, thank y'all so very much for joining us on your lunch hour. We really appreciate, again, Brad, all of your expertise and everyone sharing their ideas and how they're working in the classroom and with students. And again, if you have any additional thoughts, ideas, you can add them to that document. Thank y'all very much. Thank you again. Have a good rest of your day.
Hey, Heidi, can you hang on for a second? I've got a technical question for you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.